Welcome to the debate. Today we're tackling one of the most emotionally charged and scientifically complex topics in modern public health, the rise of the food addiction diagnosis. Amidst spiking global obesity rates and a food supply just dominated by these meticulously engineered, ultra-processed products, the very language we use to describe our struggles has, it's expanded far beyond traditional substances like alcohol or narcotics.
And at the core of that expanding definition sits a really profound disagreement, both philosophical and practical, over agency, biology, and the path to lasting change. So the central question we have to get at is this. Is the concept of food addiction a genuine neurological and psychological condition, one that demands a medical, compassionate approach? Or has it become a convenient, but maybe ultimately disempowering explanation that undermines responsibility and the development of essential life skills?
For me, the position is pretty clear. The biological evidence, coupled with the overwhelming and consistent lived experience of compulsion and the resulting self-hatred, it really validates the addiction framework. When we look at the mechanisms at play and the profound suffering involved, we see that shame-based approaches just reliably fail. Compassion, rooted in understanding these powerful biological drivers, it has to dominate the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And I come at it from a different angle. While I absolutely agree the suffering is real and that shame is destructive, I argue that applying the addiction label risks undermining the very foundations of long-term change. I'm talking about resilience, behavioral skill development, and belief in one's own agency. While these ultra-processed foods are uniquely powerful, the explanation that the addiction model offers, chemical dependency requiring treatment, is just fundamentally flawed when you apply it to eating. It often keeps people stuck.
Okay, but let's start with that lived reality, because I think it's the most compelling evidence we have. When people describe their relationship with certain foods, what they're reporting is an inability to moderate, these intense cravings that just override rational thought, compulsive eating despite clear negative consequences, and these frequent secretive eating patterns. They use the term loss of control, but it's more than that. It's a subjective helplessness against an internal drive. This suffering is not imagined, and we have to support this model because of the biology of what they're consuming. These highly palatable foods engineered with the perfect ratio of sugar, fat, salt, refined carbs are specifically designed to bypass our natural satiety cues and just relentlessly activate the brain's reward pathways. They're abnormally powerful stimuli, and the addiction language, it validates this internal conflict. Crucially, it helps reduce that devastating self-blame that comes with failing to just try harder.
That is a very compelling articulation of the struggle. I'll grant you that. But we have to confront the foundational difference that breaks the whole addiction framework. Food is essential for survival. Abstinence is literally impossible. Eating is socially and culturally reinforced multiple times a day, every single day. That continuous, inescapable navigation just complicates any standard addiction diagnosis. And I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the addiction model is inevitable. Billions of people consume these same highly engineered foods, fast food, sugary snacks, and yet they successfully regulate their intake. They stop when they're satisfied. If chemical dependency were the definitive factor here, we would see a vastly higher percentage of the population with the same chronic inability to moderate. The fact that regulation is common, even in this environment, it suggests that the real differences lie in learned behavior, learned skills, stress management, environment, not in some universal chemical dependency that dictates our fate.
But those differences in skill and context are precisely what are exploited by this food environment. We can't just dismiss the neurological reality because some people manage to regulate. For those who can't, the combination of constant reinforcement and the deliberate design of these foods creates an overwhelming compulsion. I mean, we are talking about specific food components that have been shown to cause desensitization in the brain's dopamine receptors. That means the person needs more of the stimulus just to achieve a baseline level of reward. This constant biological manipulation creates patterns that resemble addiction, not just in their structure, but in the subjective helplessness the person feels, making the drive feel automatic and just completely overwhelming.
Okay, that's an interesting point, but I'd frame it very differently. This brings us right to the crucial distinction between true chemical addiction and and what is really just efficient behavioral conditioning. You emphasize the dopamine response, but we have to be so precise here. Dopamine is widely misunderstood. Its main job isn't pleasure. It's predicting reward and reinforcing learning. It fires intensely for anything novel or necessary: learning a language, achieving a goal, social connection, and yes, eating a desirable food. If dopamine activation alone defined addiction, then achievement itself would be an addiction. Brain scans show correlation and anticipation. Sure, they reveal a powerful reinforcement mechanism, but they absolutely cannot demonstrate a loss of agency. They show an efficient biological pathway that reinforces learning, not a mandate for pathology.
But if that mechanism is constantly being manipulated by a trillion-dollar industry that's designing foods to maximize profit through maximum consumption, doesn't that fundamentally compromise a person's agency? I mean, in a way that is distinctly pathological. We are bombarded with endless cues paired with immediate, potent rewards. That loop gets reinforced so quickly and efficiently. The individual may technically be capable of choice, but the combined biological and environmental pressure it's just overwhelming. It's a rigged system.
The system is rigged, but it's rigged because the problematic eating follows incredibly powerful behavioral conditioning or habit loops. A cue, whether it's stress, boredom, fatigue, or some external trigger, it triggers the behavior, eating, which delivers an immediate reward, like relief or pleasure. Over time, especially under chronic stress, that loop becomes deeply automated. The person engages in the behavior before they're even fully, consciously aware of it, and only retrospectively interprets that action as out of control. Think about biting your nails or scrolling social media for hours. These are automated, rewarding behaviors people struggle to interrupt, but we don't label them addictions that require medical abstinence. Difficulty interrupting a well-reinforced habit does not equal addiction. It means the habit has never been systematically retrained.
And how do we stop that person from concluding they're pathologically broken when they keep failing to interrupt those loops using the standard advice they're given? Most common interventions, they rely on willpower, right? But willpower is a finite resource. Stress, chronic fatigue, trauma, poor sleep, they erode it rapidly. The person tries a willpower strategy, they fail, and then the addiction diagnosis becomes this comforting, validating explanation. It explains the failure without demanding they redesign their entire life. But it also lets them step away from the shame of just being lazy.
I agree. Willpower is absolutely the wrong metric. Those who appear disciplined, they're not relying on superior moral strength. They are proactively reducing chaos, limiting decisions, and radically structuring their environments so that willpower is rarely even needed. When we let the addiction narrative dominate, we encourage the person to seek an external cure rather than empowering them to accept responsibility for building the structure that makes success possible. They look for a cure instead of building a life where those powerful loops don't get triggered in the first place.
I'm just not convinced by that, because you risk equating responsibility with blame and setting an impossibly high standard for someone who is already completely overwhelmed. Moral judgment and shame, they reliably increase stress, which is the primary cue for emotional eating. The addiction narrative often emerges as a vital protection against that moral condemnation. It's a shield that says, my struggle is real and biologically rooted, not a defect of character. And we also have to talk about how external forces make this worse. We can't ignore the role of certain wellness and fitness cultures in contributing directly to this problem.
Tell me more. What do you mean by that?
Well, fitness culture and even some well-meaning health coaching often promotes this extreme, unsustainable rigidity. They preach arbitrary rules, clean versus dirty foods, impossible standards of purity, while also marketing indulgence and selling shortcuts. This extreme restriction, it often creates the exact environment that leads directly to the binge-restrict cycle. When that perfection inevitably collapses, the individual incorrectly concludes they suffer from a chemical dependency when, really, they were just over-constrained by an unsustainable system. They were following a broken model imposed on them. Labeling this systemic failure as an addiction is often a desperate but understandable attempt to make sense of it.
Okay, I agree entirely that the extreme restriction model coupled with Moralizing food is deeply destructive, but if we can see that the failure is systemic and behavioral, a collapse of an unsustainable system, why then apply the addiction label? That label frames the food as the narcotic. It directs people toward abstinence models, which just fundamentally fail with food. Or worse, it increases the obsession.
Because food in this context often functions as emotional technology. It's a readily available, immediate, and reliable substitute for lacking emotional literacy or stress management tools or connection. This pattern is frequently learned in childhood. Food is reward, food is comfort. Labeling the dynamic as an addiction in this sense helps the person identify that their relationship with food is pathological, not because of the nutrients, but because it's filling a non-nutritional, often traumatic void. It points them toward getting help for the underlying emotional deficit, not just the diet.
I think we're aligning on the solution but disagreeing on the label. The solution is yes, to address the emotional skills and environmental deficit. But if we use the addiction framework, we naturally gravitate toward eliminating trigger foods. And the evidence shows that eliminating those foods often increases the obsession, heightens anxiety, and raises the relapse risk, precisely because the person never learns to live with the challenging stimuli in a competent way.
But for someone who is already highly compromised, maybe dealing with chronic stress or trauma, identifying certain high-density, highly rewarding foods as non-negotiable allergens, kind of like an alcoholic avoiding bars, that can drastically reduce daily decision fatigue. Isn't that a valid pathway to stability, even if it's not the ultimate solution?
It might offer short-term psychological relief, but it harms long-term skill development. True sustainable change requires exposure, moderation, and skill that is learned, competence, not a permanent cure for a pathology. The breakthrough for people who successfully regulate their eating isn't quitting food groups, it's an identity shift. They become someone who eats intentionally and structurally rather than someone who is constantly reacting to their environment or emotions. That preservation of agency is paramount. Removing responsibility harms long-term outcomes because change only happens where agency is preserved. Responsibility isn't blame. It's just acknowledging that behavior, even highly conditioned behavior, is ultimately adjustable.
The danger I see, which the addiction narrative tries to get around, is that the moment we introduce the language of responsibility, we risk slipping back into moralizing the issue. If we ask someone who's exhausted, stressed, financially traumatized, and living in an environment saturated with cheap, hyperpalatable calories to simply develop skills, we're minimizing the monumental difficulty of that task. The addiction framework for them can be that crucial first step away from self-hatred, which allows them to seek help that targets the underlying systems without the heavy burden of moral failure.
And the danger I see is building an entrenched identity around helplessness. We have to acknowledge the difficulty of the environment without concluding that the behavior is inevitable or chemically mandated. If we tell someone you are chemically addicted, we risk justifying resignation, even when the underlying issue is largely conditioned behavior, emotional regulation failure, and environmental overload. The story we offer must empower them to change, not trap them in a label that suggests permanence.
I think we've illuminated the core tension here brilliantly. Maybe we found some convergence on the solution, even if we disagree on the utility of the label. So, to summarize my perspective, while chemical dependency might be too simplistic or even inaccurate as a clinical diagnosis, the addiction framework is undeniably real as a subjective experience. For some people mired in self-hatred, adopting this framework is profoundly helpful because it provides essential validation and allows them to seek help that looks beyond the condemning lens of just try harder.
And I'll reiterate that while the biological and environmental influences are undeniable, the addiction diagnosis is misleading as a diagnosis for most people because it risks building an identity around helplessness. The most effective path forward addresses the primary issues: conditioned behavior, emotional regulation deficits, and environmental overload. We need to focus on coaching, skill development, and structural redesign that builds competence and agency, not systems that foster dependence.
The path forward, then, has to bridge the reality of that suffering with the potential for change.
Absolutely. We have to agree on this final non-negotiable principle.
Eating behavior is powerfully influenced by biology and environment, but it is ultimately changed through skill, structure, and preserved responsibility.
Neither blame, nor excuses, nor denial. None of it serves the individual struggling.
Exactly. The true power lies in the possibility of learning and intentional competence.
A powerful note to end on. Thank you for this essential conversation.
Thank you.